Well, we're going to now talk about last week's episode, or not this week, whatever the previous episode that has just been aired of Dark Side of the Ring was on Hot Stuff Eddie Gilbert. And I liked the idea and the concept and the subject of this one, and also because I knew Eddie and it was Memphis wrestling. And you get to see again footage that has not been beat to death on national television, and a guy that doesn't get talked about as much as the usual suspects in, today's environment. But then I realized it was impossible. They told the story of Eddie's problems, but as a timeline of his life and or an explanation of those problems in any kind of detail, it was all over the place, or you can't do it. Because I think Dutch Mantell was one of the talking heads, said it probably better than anybody. I don't think Eddie ever booked anywhere longer than 6 months, maybe even not that. In Memphis, sometimes it was measured in weeks. And he was back and forth because of the problems that he had that they talked about during the show. He was so many different places and back and forth and on the outs with everybody. The timeline on this program got jumbled and a lot of stuff was glossed over, and you couldn't really explain to anybody who didn't know the story already how the fuck Eddie went from here in 85 to there in 87, but was suddenly back in 86 and was working with Jim Crockett when he briefly tried to start up a promotion again 5 years after the non-compete to blah, blah, blah. You see what I'm saying, Brian? There was no way to tell this story coherently in 45 minutes.
I don't know if I'll agree with that. I think you could have told the story coherently. You could have told the story better. It felt disjointed. It was all over the place. They fucked up the timeline. Big mistakes, little mistakes. They said that he was the booker from Mid-South. He booked for the UWF in 87. It hadn't been Mid-South in over a year. I think it's a complicated topic because it's one that wrestling fans love, but it really doesn't appeal to people who don't know wrestling. So you have to make it good. But I feel like they left out so much stuff. They glossed over stuff. They never really, other than pain pills, they never said that he had an issue with anything else. And I'm not going to say that he did or didn't, but a lot of people, who were around did. I don't know about that, but I thought it was also the way they glossed over Missy Hyatt. And I know they were only married a short period of time, but their relationship lasted. There
was another talking head that would not have participated had Missy participated, and I'm not talking about Medusa.
Right. And even if Missy wasn't going to participate, because who knows if Missy would have wanted to? We really don't know. They kind of ignored that whole world where, while working for the UWF and working with these young guys and gaining the respect of Bill Watson, his dad's there working as a referee. John Tatum's girlfriend leaves him in the middle of an angle to really go and be with Eddie. And they get married. What? Wasn't Terry Taylor and Bruce Pritchard there at the wedding? I mean, they got married while they were down there. But
and that's the thing is that I don't know what it was about that part of the country and fucking angles with wives and ex-wives or future wives. But in Dallas and or UWF for that, 2-year period, there was a lot of that type of thing happening.
And then remember, Missy got brought to the WWF to host Missy's Manor in 1987, and they wanted Eddie. And Eddie was going to go, and then Watts made him the booker. And again, this is the end. This is 87, right before Crockett bought them.
Yeah.
And that's why Eddie didn't go. And who knows if it would have worked or lasted. But the Eddie Gilbert Missy Hyatt package was a really good one that kind of burned out pretty quickly. They made it sound like Missy was his longtime manager. WCW phased her out as a manager pretty early on until the Nasty Boys came around. But again, none of that Missy Hyatt stuff really made it to this. Continental didn't even exist.
I think I saw a clip. I saw a video clip.
When you say he booked all these places for 6 months at a pop, UWF got sold. He didn't really get fired as booker as much as, I mean, I guess technically he did, but it wasn't the same thing. Continental was where he got a lot of attention because that was on national TV on cable. And that ended pretty quickly. And that was before people realized that he was going to burn out as a booker.
Well, because wasn't it the road to Birmingham that the
That's
fans
right.
loved and the early tape traders loved, that he was building to this big event in Birmingham, which was their big town? I mean, he was doing everything right in that instance, but didn't he? Wasn't it it was David Woods at that point, right, that owned the thing?
That's correct. Yes.
And the David Woods had bought from Ron Fuller. David Woods was a television executive in Alabama. He owned one of the stations that aired Continental, and he ended up buying a thing. And as often happens when somebody back in those days, especially from outside the business, bought a wrestling promotion, didn't he finally go to Eddie and say, Jesus Christ, this is costing a lot of money? And Eddie was like, well, yeah, but the booking's great. Yeah, but it's costing me a lot of money. That type of thing. There was that push pull.
Well, I guess the point of the story is Eddie did a great job of building to the road to Birmingham. He didn't make it to the road to Birmingham.
Yeah. Well, I was about to say, and then the punchline was the end of the yellow brick road, Eddie didn't get there.
But, again, we're talking about what story they told here. That's really where people put Eddie and Heyman together for the first time, where they knew they were friends, because he brought Paul and he brought Missy with him, obviously. And that was all Continental. Returns to Memphis. One of my favorite things, they showed a clip of when Lawler shows up in the studio all in black and they end up blowing into the parking lot. But again, that all happened before he returned to the NWA and got put on the committee. They jumbled all that together.
Well, yes, and we're actually jumping ahead here from the television program standpoint, because they did start obviously with Eddie as a small boy. That's where you started. And the talking heads were good. Mick, myself, Dutch, Medusa was great. Ricky Morton, that Darla Staggs, who I haven't seen since the old WFIA conventions. Todd Gordon needs subtitles, doesn't he? Can you understand him?
No, I thought the same thing.
It seems like his tongue is swelling to overfill his fucking mouth.
Yeah, my question was, did he always talk like that? Because the stuff they show him in ECW, he's always kind of yelling like this, so you can't really tell what his real speaking voice is. But yeah, he needs subtitles. You can't understand him.
Yeah, well, he didn't have anything that really add of any importance anyway. But they had great, old video footage. Most of the pictures of Eddie before he got into business and some early on, and he and Tommy were mine that I allowed them to use for the program because, as I said, I'd known Eddie since we were both 15. I met him the first time I went to Memphis. Tommy had brought he and Doug down, and I have pictures of him from that point. We were both 15 years old. And he knew that was his goal. One of these days was getting the wrestling business. And they had that picture from the WFIA convention, and I think it was 1979, was Eddie, Donnie Liable, Brian Hildebrand, Tom Burke, Pete Lederberg, Don Wilson, Dave Brzezinski. And they had the picture of Diane Devine presenting me with the photo award. That was 1978 in Knoxville. Eddie came over to the Knoxville convention also, where we stayed in the beautiful Andrew Johnson Hotel on Gay Street. That's where Terry Justice, when he came down, he was still alive doing the Bulletin. They started calling him TJ Raid because apparently one floor of the Andrew Johnson was worse than some of the rest of them. And he got on that floor and he was seen getting into the elevator with 2 cans of fucking Raid with him.
But you see, there's something that they didn't even mention that was always part of the Eddie Gilbert lore. He had a fan club before he was a wrestler. Terry Justice, and who knows how enamored he really was with Eddie. You hear lots of things. Started the TNT Power fan club before Eddie ever wrestled. And they would say, like, oh, Lou Thez was a member and this person was a member. But Eddie was getting...
Terry was comping him all the bulletins. Lou Thez didn't send in $6 to be a member of Eddie Gilbert's fan club in 1979. But that's the thing, is that Eddie had talked to all the fans there and Terry Justice doing the bulletin. And Terry was such a nice young man and so interested in the business. And, he said, I'll do a fan club for you and Tommy. And yeah, okay. And originally Eddie's name was Tommy Gilbert Jr. That's why it was TNT Power, Tommy and Tommy. And then when he did that for like 3 weeks, and I think I can't remember who was even booking at that point, probably Jerry Jarrett. Somebody said, "No, that ain't right. Let's not," because Eddie's real name was Thomas Edward Gilbert Jr.
You know,
So
they showed a brief clip of this, but let me ask you about it because it's always an angle that I loved when I saw it on video. And I think it's one of the greatest things to put over the realism of Tommy Gilbert and how believable he was. I guess it would have been right after the big talent exodus in '79, where they had the Waynes versus the Gilberts.
yeah,
And they had that angle on TV where Tommy, I just remember the way he did it. You know, you say something about my kid again, I'll beat your brains in. Like, you believe him as he's saying this. And then the Waynes like handcuff him and beat the shit out of Eddie and bloody him up.
and yeah, and see, Eddie and Ken were the same age, and I think Buddy may have been just a tad bit older than Tommy, but two father and son wrestling teams, both from the state of Tennessee, one heel, one baby face. People knew that Buddy Wayne and Tommy Gilbert had been in the territory on and off for ages, and there was a natural rivalry there. And that's again when Jarrett lost all the talent when everybody went back to Knoxville for Robert Fuller, and that's when he did the original Tupelo concession stand brawl and had like the Waynes and the Gilberts underneath and brought Fargo back and popped the territory with all of that. But you know, that was at the time, Tommy and Eddie as a father-son team. Eddie was able to fill the spot of being the rookie kid that was kind of small and he could sell, and Tommy could make the comeback because people believed in Tommy and his work was so fucking good. And then he had to get out from under Tommy's shadow at some point. That's when they put him and Ricky Morton together. This was 2 years before the Rock and Roll Express. And they did that concession stand brawl with Onita and Fuji that led to Onita thinking, well, this goddamn garbage wrestling, I could make money with this thing. So that night built that whole. And Onita had never heard of any shit like that. He'd come over as one of Baba's young boys on excursion.
This is where Darkseid pisses me off. How do you try to tell the story of that match? Again, the third Tupelo concession stand brawl. And you don't even mention the promoter's wife attacking Tojo Yamamoto. The promoter's wife attacked the wrestler who then slaps her in the face. How do you not bring that up, mention it, show the clip you showed everything else? How do you not? To really show how wild that was. That's what I would have shown.
Well,
big fat old lady. She comes in there. The camera, like, it's almost like it turned back on. Like, what's going on here? Let's turn it back on.
Oh, I know. And she's got those just cottage cheese thighs and those shorts and that flowery shirt. It's the middle of summer, I think. Anyway, so it's hot in that building. And oh God, maybe they couldn't get Miss Sheffield to sign a release. I can't remember.
How do you not show that? How do you not show that? How do you not? What the hell?
Ricky Morton had the best comment when he said, "That shit hurts, buddy." And that's the thing. It was the best one of those concession stand brawls because it was young guys that had a lot to prove and trying to work hard and get a spot. And it drew the least because it was the third time and people had seen it and it wasn't new anymore. But at that point, I mean, you know, they pushed that angle for a while, and Eddie and Ricky as a babyface team. And that was, you know, barely 2 years into when he started. And they skipped over that he'd worked as a 17-year-old over in Malden, Missouri for Henry Rogers because Tennessee had the age requirement, but he was able to sneak in and get a little experience in Malden by the time he turned 18. So anyway, and then the first run with the WWF, and I remember I talked to him on the phone a couple of times when he was up there as just before I got started. I was still doing the photography, and he sent me some programs and stuff from up there. He was so excited about it. And the match with Tiger Mask, and I was a big Tiger Mask fan, so I was like, mark it out for him. Jesus Christ, you got to work with this fucking guy. But the wreck that he had is what led to, you know, a lot of his other problems. I mean, Eddie was always, the Gilbert family was noted. I remember Teeny Christine Jarrett said to me one time, she said, Tommy's very moody. They were all moody in some respect. I don't know if this led to all of his problems, but it led to the majority of the bad ones was the car wreck. And was that not the same night as
Same night.
Snuka?
Yeah,
And
they didn't bring that up
yeah,
either. I couldn't beve it.
well, see, then you're branching off into a whole nother story. If you just said this was the same night that Snuka killed his girlfriend, people go, "What? We want to hear more about that." Well, that was season 5. We're not talking about that right
Because I
now.
think that was part of Eddie's story. Like Eddie came to in the hospital and he was on the gurney and like Fuji and Morocco were there. And he was just confused, like what was going on. They were there because of Snuka.
Yeah. So he came back in months from a broken neck and that chest compression, which did do damage to his heart, hitting the steering wheel. And he was back a few months later. And that was all because he couldn't fathom the idea of losing his spot in the WWF that he had already. I mean, and that was a big deal because nobody in those days went from Memphis to the WWF that quickly after they'd started wrestling. And I got the impression that it may have been they were going to do some kind of deal with Bob Backlund and Eddie as a protege type of thing, maybe at one point.
Well, they did kind of do that after the Mass Superstar injury thing. Bob Backlund trained him like how to do the ab wheel and neck bridges and stuff.
Yeah, but I mean, it may have been that they planned that they were going to do more of it
Earlier, before Hogan.
Earlier.
Yeah, I mean, because the stuff with the Mass Superstar was just right before Hogan got there.
Yeah. So, boom. And of course, Eddie meets George Zahorian during that run. And then Superstar gave him the neck breaker to capitalize on the neck of the whole 9 yards. But they obviously made mention of the fact that Zahorian played a part in his career from that point, even if he wasn't in the territory. We talked about all the back and forth to the booking. When he went back to Memphis in 84 and 85,
He wasn't
that's
a
when he
heel.
became.
Yeah, but that's the other thing. They said he was right away. He became hot stuff Eddie Gilbert. No, he didn't. New Fabulous
No.
Ones. They brought him in as a baby face and tried to put him in a top spot.
Yeah. He and Tommy Rich bombed as the New Fabulous Ones. And the reason for that was because Stan and Steve, Jarrett had basically lost them because they wanted to make more money. And I think that was at the point in time where he was not going to give anybody, probably besides Lawler, a guarantee. But they went to work for Vern. So Jarrett had Fargo cut the promo where, well, my boys have disappointed me, but I found 2 new boys. And it didn't work. You couldn't replace the Fabulous Ones. That was a phenomenon. And with Eddie and Tommy, no, they tried it. The New Fabulous Ones did not work. And then when they did the split, that's when Eddie started. But then again, if you tried to explain that, you'd have to explain who the Fabulous Ones were. And this gets complicated.
Yeah, well, then you could have showed the clip of Eddie bleeding all over Memphis TV while Pete Letterberg and Howard Baum stand there for the WFIA Tag Team of the Year thing, which is one of the best angles he ever did. And again, he was just bleeding everywhere. It was, both of them were. It was incredible.
But anyway, that's when Hot Stuff came out, and I liked the when he had, especially when he had the perm, and they'd found girls to do the music videos with because he was trying to do the MTV thing. But that's during that period of time, he got a chance to go to Mid-South and work there and develop himself more as a heel. And that's where he was there for a while until Watts
2 years
finally decided, okay, maybe I'm going to give this kid an opportunity to book. And it was timing. It wasn't Eddie's fault that the economy, around Louisiana collapsed and the oil fucking deal, whatever the fuck. But Watts had tried to expand and it wasn't happening. And he had to sell to Crockett. And that kind of derailed Eddie again. And you saw from that shoot interview that they had clips of that he did
with Bob Barnett. That was Bob Barnett's video.
Yeah. And I wish he'd invested in either a light or a hotel room with bulbs in the lamps. But at that point, Crockett had bought the UWF, and Dusty was in charge of creative for Crockett, and he was going to figure out who did what at that point and probably tell them what to do, same as he sent Dundee to book Kansas City. And he had sent Bubba Rogers there to get experience, and he did the same thing with Bubba and the UWF. It was all going to be interconnected, but the television show here acted like Eddie went straight from the UWF to the WCW creative, and that was a year and a half, wasn't it? Because that's when he went to Continental.
That's when he went to Continental and then Memphis, and then he returned at the end of
and
88.
then Memphis again.
Yeah. That's right.
Because,
actually, you're right. It was Memphis at the beginning of 88, and then Continental, then Memphis at the end of 88, and then he went back to the NWA. They did the thing with Ricky Steamboat.
Yes, and he went finally back to the NWA because that's when Dusty had left, when they fired Dusty over the Road Warriors angle. That was a year and a half later. He didn't go straight to creative because there was no creative committee for Crockett. It was Dusty until November 88. So that's where again, the back and forth booking, the timeline gets confusing, but Eddie was doing a good job again, good TV with the UWF, but the territory had gone down because they had a financial recession in the whole core market, and they tried to expand too quick. Same thing that Crockett did without really a recession in his core area. And I can't remember who that Dusty put in charge of the UWF before they melded it together into one, but he asked me one time, I think I've told you this, on Crockett's plane, we're riding somewhere, and Dusty asked me, because he knew that the Midnight and I had worked Louisiana. He said, "Kid, do you think you could book Louisiana?" And I shit myself because I didn't want to say, no, I don't think I can book anything to Dusty Rhodes, right? I would want to say I had confidence, but at the same time, I was afraid if I said that I think I could, he would have let me. And it was a dead fucking territory. I was like, me in the Midnight, we're the fucking main roster here making good money, and we don't want to get sent out to Louisiana like Bubba got sent to Kansas City. So I said something to the effect of, well, Dusty, the territory's been in bad shape for a while. And he moved on with other topics. But that's, that was the thing, is that setup wasn't going to particularly be a long-term thing anyway.
Hey, real quick, if you don't mind me asking a quick aside that just popped up. I didn't know about that conversation. Do you think Dusty saw you before then as a future booker? When did you first think that Dusty may see you as someone who's not just a performer, someone who could do stuff behind the scenes?
Well, probably, it depends on what stuff is behind the scenes. He pretty much from the start left me alone on promos, except to tell me the subjects to talk about or what to sell. And then by a year and a half, I was doing the finishes for the Midnight for TV matches pretty much straight off also. As far as house shows, finishes, or contributing to the finishes in top matches, important angles, after 86, yeah, he would, if I said, hey, Dusty, what about blah, 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 he would start listing there. So, and this was 87 late. So somewhere and then remember in 88, I pitched the Fantastics, and he went with that. The idea of the angle, bringing them in, the order of matches. And then the original Midnight, he had agreed to, and unfortunately was gone 2 weeks after we shot the angle, which is what killed that. But so after a little while, different things. But anywho, as Dutch said, one of the worst things you can do is be on a booking committee. And that was true. And it never works. And they've never worked. And we've talked about our WCW deep dives, Brian. How can the people find the 89 fiasco and booking committee on YouTube for the background of this? What are those
Oh,
videos titled?
just go to YouTube and search for Jim Cornette Omnibus, and it'll be one of those.
Well, basically the 1989, 88 into 89 booking situation in WCW. Eddie had gotten there, and Jim Ross was always a big proponent of Eddie's. And it's not like anybody was particularly burying him to begin with. But George Scott was the booker, and that's how Steamboat came back. And since Eddie had been involved in the deal with Wyndham, and they had the match with Flair and Wyndham, Eddie and Steamboat, the mystery part, and debuted Steamboat that way. And then Eddie was being used, but when George Scott got fired, that's when the committee was formed. Jim Ross, Eddie Gilbert, Kevin Sullivan, Jody Hamilton was in there, Jim Barnett, Jim Hurd. And the committee, as we've talked about, their results were even worse than George Scott's booking because he had set the thing on such a pace that in 3 months they couldn't turn it around. It was getting worse. And George Scott had, pissed off a lot of talent, done a variety of damage. So that's why Flair, in the middle of summertime, told Hurd, said, no, this thing is fucking collapsing. From where we were 6 months ago, this is insane. I want to be the booker. And that's how he got the job. And as documentation in our history and my records have also shown, Flair was the most successful one for the first fucking 5 years they owned the company. But nevertheless, how I got involved in this, and I want to clarify something that again was glossed over on the show. The finish that Eddie changed in Memphis, and I'll get to the details in a second, it wasn't changed for him to win the match by pinfall and beat Ron Simmons. He changed it to a DQ. So he still changed the finish, but it wasn't as heinous as what it was reenacted to be. But I think there was tension with Flair and Eddie from the start because Flair knew Jim Ross. Flair obviously knew Kevin Sullivan. Flair obviously knew Jim Barnett, and Barnett wasn't throwing out, this and that angle and that finish and all that stuff. He was there as an advisor to Hurd, who was whistling Stranger in Paradise. The one that Flair had the problem with from the start was Hurd, but Flair also, I don't think, he and Eddie were from two different schools of booking. In Memphis, it's a weekly territory, and you use everybody, you involve everybody. The guy could be in the first match 1 week, but you shoot an angle and he's in the main event the next week. And it's, it's crazier. It's a little more chaos. That was Eddie's style because that's what he grew up on and that's what he knew. Flair was more Carolina. Flair had been all over the world. He'd seen every kind of booking, but Carolina's St. Louis, the bigger picture, you've got clear main event guys, clear mid-card guys, clear preliminary guys. You do the angles and the ha-ha and the gaga with the main guys. You don't do it with everybody up and down the card. When Kevin and I would try to do stuff with Mick Foley, Flair would sit down. Do you see him wrestling for the NWA world title? No, at that time we didn't, regardless of who the champion was. So don't worry about him. Let's concentrate on the money. He had that fucking philosophy. He would book the opponents in the main event matches and let us fill in details of those and then put the rest of the card together. So I think they had two different philosophies. Flair didn't recognize Eddie as a major talent because in that atmosphere, you've got to remember that Eddie probably, if he was going to work for the big companies starting in the 90s, it would have been in creative. If he worked, it would have been middle card in the WWF or in WCW, and he would have been more involved in booking because, yes, Eddie could be a top guy in Continental in the ring. Eddie could be a top guy in Memphis in the ring. But now you've got Eddie on national television as a wrestler when you've got Ricky Steamboat and Ric Flair and the Road Warriors and the Midnight Express and Barry Windham and world class guys. Brian, I'm not being disrespectful to Eddie when I say that maybe in the ring, although he was very good, that's kind of elite company on a national television show. He was not going to main event in that environment, right?
I think that's fair.
So, from the way they picked talent to their approach, Flair and Eddie were not particularly suited for each other. But the thing that I said was true in that Flair called me on the phone one day and he said, I'm fixing to have an opening on the creative team. Are you interested? And I'm like, oh, yes, because right here, yes, on the big one, not getting sent to Louisiana, yes. But that's what he told me. They had a show in Memphis at the Coliseum. Flair wasn't on the card. Eddie, as a representative of the booking committee, had changed the finish on a preliminary match between him and Ron Simmons because he didn't think as a babyface in Memphis, even in a preliminary match, he should do a job, even to Ron Simmons. And he changed it to a DQ because Simmons was a heel. And then the worst things have happened, but still, come on. That was the problem, is that Eddie was taking the small picture seriously and not looking at the big picture. You know, the new booker has come in and it's Ric fucking Flair. So you're going to change his finish that he gave you of a preliminary match in Memphis because you don't want to lose in Memphis to Ron Simmons, Ron Simmons is Flair's kind of guy. Florida State football, real athlete, All-American. He's going to push this motherfucker. And so he just, the things that people get upset about, Vince McMahon has his peccadillos. Flair was like, can you believe this fucking guy changed the fucking finish? And I'm just kind of sitting there like, yeah. So he said, I'll let you know since you're interested. And about a week later, okay, you start coming to the booking meetings because he had to move Eddie out. I felt bad, but what am I going to do? I didn't change the fucking finish. And at least I got to tell the story that it went around for quite some time. And I believe it came from Eddie that, well, I walked in one day and Cornette was in my chair. No, I was never in the same meeting as Eddie. He was gone, done, and I started.
And again, to tie back to, they told part of the story at the end with ECW with Heyman and him, but Eddie gets pushed out from the booking committee. That's right when Heyman has his meltdown with Ric Flair.
Yes, as a matter of fact.
It was all interconnected. Remember, the trouble they got in the next year when they revealed that there was a program, I guess, in the works with Lawler and Luger, and then it came out and never happened. And I think it was Eddie that planted the seed with all the sheet writers.
But yeah, Paul and Eddie had their own sheet pipeline back then. They were...
Back
and
then,
then,
yeah.
Well, yeah. Hurd let Eddie out of his contract to go back to book Memphis. And see, that's the thing. Okay, I know he wanted to be the booker, and I bet his feelings were hurt that he was demoted, but he had a contract making at minimum $100,000 a year, and he may have been on one of the 125 or 150s because that was the range at that point. And he got out of that early to go back and book Memphis when the main event guys there, besides Lawler, probably weren't making $500 a week. Instead of staying on tele, and I know I've left on a lot of money to go do my own thing also, but I was kind of going to actually be the boss of most of it, but also he didn't have a lot of options left and he hadn't saved a lot of money. And he just wanted to be the booker so bad that he would be the booker in front of almost nobody, then rather than still stay on national television and try to work harder to get over with the people and the blah, 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 even if there's tension with the booker.
And again, he wasn't even 30. And that's the other thing. Like, all this is happening. I think he's still like 28, 29 years old. And
yeah.
With WCW, that's when him and Missy broke up. And that couldn't have been easy because she was someone featured on air, eventually featured more than him, even though they were tied together in the early days. And then all of a sudden it was kind of like, all right, now you're just going to be with the Steiners. All right, now just have Missy host segments.
Yeah. And it was a Mark Marrow and Sable situation also, where everybody was looking at her and nobody was looking at him. But that run in Memphis is when he ran Lawler over in the parking lot. And the fans actually lit up the switchboard of the police station, calling them, or 911 or whatever, calling the cops, saying there's been a murder, a vehicular murder on TV on Channel 5. And the cops went over there not to arrest somebody for murder, because as soon as they heard Lawler and Channel 5, they knew what was going on. But they went over there and told Lawler, go out there and show these fucking people that you're still alive, or we're going to take you to jail. Because we got crooks to catch, and everybody in town is calling us to go avenge your death. So, I mean, he got people talking and he wanted to go to jail he said, I'll go to jail for it, which that's what they used to do in the old days for angles. The guy, they'd have a fight on the street and the guy'd get arrested on purpose, go to jail, make the paper. But they weren't going to arrest Eddie because the cops knew it was a work. They were going to be mad at the wrestling company if they didn't, I guess the thing, go ahead.
So that's 1990. Obviously he does indies. He works for Joel Goodhart, Dennis Carluzzo, things like that. But when you came in 91 with the Fabulous Ones,
yeah,
that wasn't the same run, right? Am I wrong? But he had already left and come back to Memphis in the middle of that.
No, well, I don't know how many times he left and came back before I got there, but the deal, I had come home, was it Thanksgiving? It was Thanksgiving. I came home Thanksgiving 1990 because it's first time I'd had time off in ages because we just quit WCW. And I wanted to go down to the matches and, fucking see everybody and visit Teeny and whatever. And I'm trying to think. I think I talked to Eddie because Eddie called it. I said, I'll be there at the Louisville Gardens Tuesday after Thanksgiving or whatever, or before whatever it was, if you want to talk about doing something. And then I watched the TV that Saturday morning before the Tuesday, and he had booked me. I was in Jeff Jarrett's corner against him and his manager, Sam Lowe. And I thought, okay, I got to go buy a suit. And then we talked about, because Stan had quit also, so that's where I pitched him an angle. Let's come in and do this with Lawler and etc. And we can, he wanted to first, because we came in as baby faces to help Lawler against Eddie and his brother Doug and a dirty white boy. I think we had 6 men. Downtown Bruno was their manager, so we had 8 men. And then we turned on Lawler on TV, and the angle was laid out. I still have it on paper around here somewhere, where we'd work with Lawler and Dundee, and then that would lead to Lawler and Jeff, and then Fargo would come in, and we would put Fargo in a fucking hospital. And then either that would get the business up or somebody would kill us. And then he'd come back and blah, 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 and then they'd beat the fuck out of all of us, and off we'd go. And Eddie agreed to all that. And we started, Eddie gave us a guarantee, and we agreed to that. And then I don't know if we actually started that program. As a matter of fact, I don't think we did. We had set it to start, and we had a date, and Jerry Jarrett called me up and said, well, I fired Eddie as my booker. And I want to know what y'all were going to do, because he didn't tell me. So I told him, I said, well, this is going to be that. And I told him the whole thing again, and he loved it. He said, that's great. We'll do it. So we started doing it. And that's when the goddamn Gulf War happened, and the TVs were preempted, and everybody was getting bombed. And Memphis TV for the first time was knocked off the air by news. And we did okay, but not anything to brag about. I think Memphis was at $4,000 the first week, and we got it up to, I think, 12. And Nashville, we got from 2 to 6. But I mean, it was just puny. And then Jerry said once that we brought Fargo in, instead of hurting him, putting him in the hospital, and then doing the other stuff, and then coming back in 6 weeks and blowing it off, he said, let's just finish it here. I can't afford y'all anymore. I was like, we were $300 a night or something. I was, all right, God damn it. This whole thing's been fucked up with the TVs and everything. So Fargo comes in, he's the referee, or no, he's in there. I can't remember what we did. And we do the blow off and they beat us. Jeff and Lawler and Dundee's involved in Fargo. And then we're going back to the locker room, me and the Fabs. And I swear to God, Eddie Gilbert runs by us. Didn't even know he was there. He ran by us on the way to the ring and fucking threw a fireball and burned Lawler. And the next week, it was Eddie Gilbert versus Jerry Lawler again. That had been the main event on the $4,000 house the week before we started this fucking thing. See, fired Eddie. We did a 6-week angle. Eddie brought Eddie back and put him in the fucking main event.
But that's one of those Eddie things. You never knew if it was part of the show or not when all of a sudden he started running into the ring.
Yes. Well, and they brought that up with the, I should mention also chronologically, I was there for the Cactus Jack and Eddie Gilbert thing for Joel Goodhart's TWA in Philadelphia. I was on the card that night also. And they didn't have a 2 out of 3 fall match. They had a 2 out of 3 match series in one night. And I can't remember the stipulations exactly, but it was like one match was Falls Count Anywhere. And then one match was, goddamn, I don't know, no disqualification. And then the third match was barbed wire. And they did it first and in the middle and then on last. And that had never been done before. I don't know if anybody's done it since. And Cactus loved the idea of it. This was a hot indie. Nobody knew at the time that Goodhart was selling out and losing money. But it got a lot of attention again. And Eddie was in something that got a lot of attention. But did you see the shot with the bottle where he broke the bottle over Mick's head?
Oh, yeah. I remember that. That was a big deal. Again, all these pictures of these matches, even though it was an indie, because it was in Philadelphia, it was in PWI. It was in the Napolitano magazines. So when magazines still mattered, these photos were out there.
They didn't bake the bottle. Eddie came up to me because I was talking to him about it. I said, this is a wild deal you're going to do tonight, right? He said, I'm going to break his bottle over his head. He said, we're not baking it. I said, what? Can you do that? He said, he says he can. Cactus wanted it to look so good. He said, just break the bottle over my head. So that was actually Eddie Gilbert breaking a bottle over a motherfucker's head.
But it didn't break right away.
Yes, it did. No, well, not the first time. They showed the shot where it broke. It broke eventually.
Eventually it did, yeah.
But I think he hit him like 3 times. And you heard this dull thunk. And I was, what the fuck? So then he began working for Todd Gordon, the Tony Khan of 1993, who, regardless of whatever you think about ECW, whether you liked it or not, when he said, I just wanted something believable like what I grew up with, would you call, of all things that you could call ECW good or bad, would it be the most believable wrestling you've ever seen? Would that be a description?
Hard hitting. I don't know if believable is necessarily the word, but
believable would indicate that we don't obviously see that these fuckers are doing this on purpose. And that was not the case. But nevertheless, and I mean, we've talked about this. Memphis didn't work in Philadelphia like Philadelphia wouldn't have worked in Memphis. And Eddie was the king of Philly, and they're on Sports Channel Philadelphia. Nobody's seeing this thing. And I think they probably had more fans around the country trading tapes than they actually had in Philadelphia. And then Eddie was paranoid, and per Todd Gordon, he was paranoid and he quit. And Eddie had been quoted as saying in the shoot that he did, when a booker takes over, there's a power struggle starting from day one. God damn it. That may be, he'd been booking Continental when business was blah. And most of the Fullers just wanted to go to the goddamn lake and do their shit, right? I don't think that there was a horrible power struggle in Memphis. Nobody wanted the booker's job. At that point,
But you see, that's part of the thing too. It was very public amongst smart fans because it was very public that Eddie was butting heads with Lawler or whatever was going on in Memphis. It wasn't like a smooth booking journey. And it was always like a countdown, it felt like, until when is Eddie going to be gone again? I mean, they didn't even bring up the GWF here. He booked the GWF.
Oh, I forgot about that.
Yeah. That was the last good period of the GWF. The Patriot.
The Global Wrestling Federation.
Yeah. After the Patriot left, the big feud was the Dark Patriot, Doug Gilbert versus Eddie Gilbert.
And let me ask you this.
Managed by Bruce Pritchard.
Well, what would the smart... Yeah, because Bruce had got fired and he wanted to go to Texas. What would the smart fans do today if the booker booked his brother, who's never drawn a dime in his life, under a full body outfit to work with him in the main event?
Well, it would definitely be a different reaction nowadays, especially if it was someone unproven or, if it was just known, people would react to it. If Penta was the booker and he was in a feud with Ray Phoenix, it's not the same as Randy Savage working with Lanny Poffo.
Actually, Lanny Poffo drew some money every once in a while, but nevertheless. So Eddie, Todd Gordon says Eddie's paranoid and he got mad and he quit days before their big show. But then he called him to say he was sorry a couple of days beforehand. Todd Gordon had replaced him with Kevin Sullivan, not as booker, but as in his match as an in-ring talent. But Eddie said he wanted to come and say goodbye to the boys. And then, were you there or you heard about it? Was that one of your, because you've told me the story, because I wasn't there.
No, I didn't go. I was talking to people who were there and I knew, I was really into everything happening at the time.
So he goes out that nobody knows Eddie. Nobody knows he's going to do this and nobody said he could do it. He goes out and starts doing a promo in the ring, even though that it was announced that he would not be there. Some had happened, he's being replaced, but Eddie shows up and goes out in the finish of the match where they can't cut around it and starts doing a promo. This is basically what happened, right?
Yeah, and again, if Eddie was following the news and all of a sudden he heard Kevin Sullivan was there, he had to know that meant that Paulie was getting power and control. And, they kind of talked about the issues with those two, but they didn't really go into how it fell apart so quickly. And again, the only outside substance that was mentioned here was painkillers. Who knows what was really going on at the time? People that were very involved and knew people thought maybe there were other things involved. But
was caffeine involved?
He may have been very caffeinated. They brought up that Paulie at that time was all about Jim Crockett. I mean, that was one of the quotes that people said that he said backstage. This is Jim Crockett's show now.
Yeah.
And Eddie Gilbert.
And before we gloss over some of the fans, before we lose them, Jim Crockett, his 5-year non-compete had ended, and he was trying to start the wrestling network out of Dallas. And he thought Paul was going to be his booker because Paul wanted to be his booker because Paul was going to be, that would be national television that he wanted to get a hold of. And Paul and Kevin were always close. Kevin's coming in, Paul's there, Eddie's paranoid, whatever, all these people. And when Eddie goes to the fucking ring to cut the promo, Paul's screaming, cut the mic, right? But the rib was apparently Eddie didn't really say anything bad like fuck these people. He said, please keep supporting ECW, who's trying to sweet talk Todd into getting his job back.
Yeah, I think Eddie really felt remorseful. I mean, he called Todd back already and tried to get back on after Kevin Sullivan got booked. And again, I don't know how doing a run-in, even if you are going to do it, if you say, I'm just going to run in and thank the fans, why would anyone believe you? Why would anyone think, okay, that sounds reasonable?
Well, oh, yeah. I mean, it's preposterous, but apparently that's what he was really going to do. But he did it to finish the match. And Paul, who's obviously thinking, what would I do in this situation? I'd try to fuck everybody as best I could because that's what he always does. See Corluzzo's comma Dennis in the NWA. He cuts fucking Eddie's mic. Well, then Doug is there, Eddie's brother, who, as everyone can tell, is probably not a Mensa member. And Doug takes a baseball bat and clears out busts up the fucking locker room. So that certainly made the Gilberts welcome to come back. And apparently, from that incident, Paul and Eddie never spoke again.
What would you think if you were the booker and unexpectedly your best friend, who at the moment you're having issues with, that may be based around substance abuse, maybe based around jealousy, maybe based around opportunism?
Maybe based around the fact the guys just quit and left the promoter in the lurch 5 days before the big show that he booked and is starring on. And then he shows up anyway. So I'm just going to go cut a promo. I'm not going to tell anybody about it. I'd have yanked his fucking cord too.
Do you think Paul Heyman did Paul Heyman do anything wrong accepting that booking job? Like you were saying before, the story was Jim Cornette was one day sitting in my chair. Paul Heyman was working in ECW. He was Eddie's manager. Obviously, he knew Todd Gordon and had conversations with him. Did Paul, who has always been an opportunist, for
You're
good or for
setting
bad,
me up to.
But did Paul do anything wrong accepting that job, doing that job? Do you think Paul did anything wrong there?
Well, they're wildly different setups to this, but no, technically not. Now, did Paul see? We never know with Paul what actions he may have taken or not taken to benefit himself. Did he step in when he didn't have to step in, or vice versa? He's very subtle with these things. But Paul had been Eddie's protege, and Eddie had been the booker, and he had taken Paul around as the heel manager and the assistant and the good friend and etc. They're both there together. If Todd Gordon had suddenly come to Paul and said, I don't like Eddie anymore, and I don't like his work, and I want you to be the booker. Well, that may have been a tough spot to take. Well, he didn't really do anything wrong. But when Eddie called up and fucking quit and said, I'm not going to be there, well, then no, Paul didn't do anything wrong. But the question is, who was telling Eddie? Maybe his brother, maybe somebody else. This fucking guy's not respecting you. Or what words were put in at what time to take an already susceptible thinker and make him more susceptible to thinking something.
Yeah,
I think would be, we'll never know. Nobody will know. But that may have something, because who's the guy that would call me up after I walked out of WCW before it was blatantly obvious I wasn't coming back? He'd call me up and he'd say, you got him right where you want him. They'll give you anything to come back. I'm not coming back, Paul. They'll give you anything. I'm not coming back, Paul. Every once in a while, just to see, before I had left, he would come up to me and start talking to me about how fucking stupid it was that they were doing this to our angle and that to our angle. And he put his arm around me and almost walked me to the back door. Like, you ought to just walk out right now. So you never know what kind of fucking sway.
Right. But also it's a little different not knowing how the future will turn out. It's a little different pushing someone out of a position working for a national company like WCW versus the booker for ECW. It wasn't like Todd Gordon was paying them a terrible amount of money or anything. It was still
but that's the thing is Eddie was in some cases, as people say, Jim Ross said this about Eddie one time to me during this 1989 thing. Eddie's his own worst enemy because he was impatient not only to get the things he wanted, but once he had them, he was impatient that people were interfering with it. And I mean, I can identify, but I had a history of waiting a lot longer to blow up and then potentially blowing up a little bit farther. But I try to work within what the conditions were that prevailed in most respects until finally I just had my Popeye moment. But Eddie's Popeye moments came quickly.
Yeah, they didn't even bring up one that you kind of consider an Eddie moment because he's there, but it may be more of a Doug moment. But I remember in that shoot interview that Bob Barnett did, it was brought up. Remember they went to work for Wing, but he didn't work as Eddie Gilbert. He was working like as Freddy Krueger or something. He was working under a mask.
Yes. Well, when they did the movie Monsters, they had Michael Myers and they had Freddy Krueger.
Oh, maybe it was Michael Myers.
Jason.
No, that's what it was. He was as Michael Myers and Doug was, I forget what Doug was. Maybe he was Freddy Krueger.
I think Doug was Freddy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they both pull off their masks and Eddie just stands there and it's Doug on the mic We're the Gilberts, and this place is full of shit, and the Ibaragi's full of shit. In Japan, all of a sudden they're doing the stuff they do here in Japan.
I know they go all the way to Japan for some outlaw group anyway, and they're in a fucking bar. It's not like Japan in those days. It was a fucking indie outlaw group doing movie monsters in the ring, and they unmask and Doug, and you can barely understand him because he's a hillbilly, cuts a fucking promo on the mic screaming while they're acting, and they unmasked, and people were like, there was no response whatsoever because
there's no history in Japan.
Who the fuck they were?
Yeah.
So
this is my brother Eddie Gilbert. He never. I don't think Eddie ever toured Japan.
Yeah, we're not going to put up with this kind of treatment. I guess they didn't want to be the movie monsters. Well, why did they go over there to go all that way to?
It's weird when you do we're not going to put up with this kind of treatment and like you're in a high school gym.
Yeah.
Like, it's one thing if you're in an arena, it's like, okay, I sent a message. But when you're in a gym and the cafeteria's next door, it's like you didn't really send any message.
If Ernie Ladd's trick of if the promoter wouldn't pay him what he thought he was worth, walking around the ring and then out the front door of the arena didn't work if it was a fucking high school gym with 82 people in it.
So this kind of leads us into the end of 94. I got to meet Eddie at the NWA tournament, November 19th, 94 in Cherry Hill that Dennis did. You were there, obviously. It was it was a fun weekend. ECW ran against it. That was when they had the deal where WCW gave them talent to settle a potential lawsuit over When Worlds Collide, I believe. So they got Kevin Sullivan and maybe Sherry. And I think they were supposed to get Steve Austin, but they got Brian Pillman. So
didn't they get Bobby and Arn at one point?
That was in 94. That was earlier in 94. Yeah. Bobby and Arn is like the one feud that it's kind of cool. It went from WCW to Smoky Mountain to ECW. It just kept moving from one place to another, and it was great everywhere it went. But Eddie came up and worked that, and he did brawls with, I think, Tom Brandi and Tracy Smothers, which were a lot of fun. That was before those were commonplace everywhere, especially in the Northeast. It was a Memphis thing. It felt like it was he's bringing Memphis stuff up here for those that didn't know any better. And then a few months later, he goes to work for you. And then a few weeks later, whatever it is, he goes to Puerto Rico. But, that's why when people talk about what would have Eddie's future have been, if that made any sense the way I said it, what would Eddie's future have been if he had not passed as young as he did? Later that year is when Nitro comes out. A couple of years later is when WWF starts changing the way they do TV to...
They'd already started Monday Night Raw.
Yeah, they already had Raw since 93, but, they get the Attitude Era a few years later. I don't know. I always wonder, would Eddie have been a guy that had a tough time finding things to do, and then a new generation of kids would rediscover him in, 2010, and all of a sudden he's working Ring of Honor or something, and then he, walks out or...
in all seriousness, here is the problem. And the situation with Smoky Mountain and Puerto Rico illustrates, if all things being equal for the Attitude Era, when not only WCW was hiring more people, but then the WWF was expanding and everything that has happened since then, Eddie's future would have been in producing, in booking, in agenting, even if it was for a TNA or a Ring of Honor, much less rather than a WWE or whatever, that would have been where it was, but all things weren't equal. Because think about this, as I was sitting there watching the show, I realized the juxtaposition of this. I needed a new heel tag team in Smoky Mountain Wrestling, and we needed to just draw some money, generally. And Thanksgiving of 94, blown off a bunch of stuff. And, and in Christmas, we did fan appreciation night and everything in the big Christmas show, but you got to start the year with something. And I'd heard that Eddie was in Lexington, Tennessee, home, not working Memphis. He had actually tried to run for some type of political office in Lexington or in that county.
Yeah, I forgot about that. That was a thing at that time. Yeah.
Yeah. But he wouldn't work in Memphis because he was on the outs with Lawler or Jarrett, whoever the fuck, and he wasn't anywhere else. And he's in effect, he's 300 miles away from Knoxville. So I called him and I said, Eddie, I got this idea because that's when Dutch had recommended Glenn Jacobs, Unabomb. He needs to get out of Puerto Rico. He's a great kid. Take him. He's 7 feet tall. Okay. I need a partner for him that can talk and work because he's green and blah. He doesn't know what he's doing yet. Eddie, you want to be this guy's part? It's Shawn Michaels and Diesel pairing. You be hot stuff. Help me with this thing. Help do your own stuff. Come up with your own shit or help me book it. I just need to draw some money. I'm a little tired. I could use some help, right? Throw some shit in, whatever the fuck. You're across the state from home. You can work here every weekend. You can be home the rest of the week, and you're going to be on television. And he's okay. And he did the first taping where we did 4 TV shows. He came out, did an interview, worked with Ricky Morton, shot an angle with Unabomb, came back and had Eddie Gilbert and Unabomb against the Rock and Roll Express. And that's the last time I ever saw him. And Ricky Morton's sitting there. Cornette Ricky has never met an exaggeration he didn't like.
I wanted to hear what you thought of what he said here.
Well, Ricky said, Eddie told me I ain't coming back. I got the chance to go to Puerto Rico. Well, I wish he'd have told me. I mean, Eddie or Ricky. I don't think that he actually told Ricky then. I really don't. And to be honest, I don't even know if he'd been called yet. Because the problem was we had from like the first Monday in January of 1995 to January 28th between that TV taping and when Eddie was booked next in Knoxville. And I think he got a call probably in between those times. And it was to book Puerto Rico, and he'd rather book than breathe. So, with all respect to Ricky, and it's 30 years ago, maybe he remembers it that way. But I think Ricky at the time would have come to me and said, hey, we're going to have to find somebody else to work with in Knoxville because it was fucking his deal up. And as I recall, when I heard a couple weeks later after the TV, somebody said, or the results were on a newsletter or whatever, Eddie was in Puerto Rico. So I called Tommy Gilbert. I called Eddie's house and I got Tommy. I said, Tommy, is Eddie coming back from Puerto Rico for this shot on I haven't talked to him today. I'll tell him to call you. And I didn't hear nothing. And then that's when we had to find Al Snow. But the point is, Ricky and Robert didn't seem too happy when Eddie didn't show up and we were having to go through all this switching and everything. But here's the goddamn deal. He went to take a booking job in Puerto Rico for a company that not only was not doing the business it had historically at that time, but also had no relationship with the WWF. Whereas I'd already sent guys to the WWF. WWF talent was coming down to my shows regularly. It was the door at that point in time if Eddie wanted to go somewhere. Because later on, not only the Rock and Roll Express for a brief period of time would end up there, but Al Snow, the guy that replaced him, would end up there. And his partner, Glenn Jacobs, would end up there. And Chris Candido and a bunch of other people he'd been working with ended up there. He shot himself in the foot by going away from the opportunity because he wanted to be the booker. And he didn't want to be kind of the half booker with me. He wanted to be the whole booker.
Do you think there was heat? Do you think there was heat, from one-sided heat going back to the WCW thing and the booking committee? Do you think that lasted with him, or he screwed you over the way he would have screwed anyone over?
Well, it had been 5 years. And besides that, if there'd have been heat when I called him up and said, hey, you want to do this? Why would he fake that he was so excited to do it and work out the whole deal and the money and the dates and everything just so that he could come and no-show me to get even with me? He got a chance to book, and that was more important than anything else. Even a chance to be in your home state and make the same amount of money as you are in another goddamn hemisphere and lose a chance to maybe get seen. And Jim Ross was there. And he was soon to go back to the WWF. He was doing my fucking announcing, and he knew it. He was a fan of Eddie's from before. He had a bunch of his friends and a bunch of people that he could work with that were connected to the WWF, and instead he went to Puerto Rico to be the booker, where he had no talent to work for him and no fucking gates. So, and I said on the TV show, again, 3 months later, he was dead. Turns out it was 6 weeks. 6 weeks after he had done that show for me. I never saw him again, and he was dead.
And we brought up Ken Wayne earlier, who, obviously is in jail for being a pervert and a dirtbag, but...
And that one surprised me almost more than anything else in the history of wrestling, but go ahead.
But I believe the story was, and correct me if I'm wrong, he was in that early feud we mentioned earlier, the Waynes against the Gilberts at the very start of Eddie's career in Memphis.
He was the one that found him.
Right? Wasn't that the story? He climbed in the window and found him when he didn't respond?
Yeah, because, let's face it, at this point, Ken didn't really have it. The territories were all gone. A lot of guys were, going to Puerto Rico or doing whatever they had to do and Eddie and Ken had known each other for a long time. So he booked Ken down there, and Ken's one had to climb in the window and fucking find him. But anyhow, and I thought for a long time, I was like, for 6 weeks, I was mad at him. Why the fuck would he do this to me? Why didn't he just say no at the start or be honest and call me? But then obviously after he dies, I didn't stay mad at him after that. But I felt bad that if he hadn't left Tennessee and gone there, it might not have happened. Probably wouldn't have happened.
Look at it on the other side. If it would have happened, if it was really just years of buildup of his heart and mixed with the pain medication, if that's really what it was, and it happened when he was working for you, it would have gotten a ton of negative publicity for your company, right?
Well, I've never even thought of that or thought of it that way, but probably wouldn't have helped. You can't get any worse publicity than Puerto Rican wrestling has gotten. That was nothing down there, but yeah, that would have been a kind of a big deal.
What did you think? Because I had never seen it before, and I'm sure you hadn't either. I don't know. It looked like it was inside the house, but Doug Gilbert almost had a museum of Eddie Gilbert. Did you see that?
Yeah. Well, that looks like that's his office in his house now. And
that's really cool. Yeah.
Can't blame him for that. He's got a lot of Eddie stuff. And he looked up, Doug looked up to both of them looked up to Tommy as their father. And Doug looked up to Eddie as his big brother, closer than most. I wish I had better things to say about Doug, but he's just a fucking idiot and pissed me off 10 years ago just being stupid.
He started it. I can actually say that.
He actually started for, oh, goddamn, I'm going to tell that story. It's my show, and then I'll end it up. So Howard Brody writes his fucking biography, right? Swimming with Piranhas, My Life in Wrestling or whatever it was. And Howard sends me the manuscript, and before it was printed into book form, the manuscript was like 1,000 fucking pages. He had taken notes on everything he'd ever done in his life. I said, Howard, you certainly wrote a long book. But I wrote him a foreword to his book because he's a friend of mine and it helped me, and what I was able to read of the book seemed captivating. And so I wrote it, my friend Howard wrote this book, and he's had many ups and downs in wrestling by this book. And when they print the book, it's on the cover, Swimming with Piranhas by Howard Brody, foreword by Jim Cornette. And then one day on the internet, Doug Gilbert is calling me a no-good motherfucker and a liar and a piece of shit. And Stacy said, what? She's on the computer. She said, what the fuck is Doug Gilbert's problem? And I think he'd found her Facebook cussing me out or some shit. And I said, what the fuck? And the book that you and Howard Brody wrote and what you said about my brother, I said, what the fuck is about? I wrote the foreword to Howard Brody's book. And I didn't even remember what Howard said about Eddie, but he always liked Eddie, was complimentary about Eddie, but he was also honest that Eddie probably had some chemical help in the mistakes he made. And fucking Doug Gilbert is cussing me out for this and calling me all kinds of names. You lied about my brother. I said, you fucking hillbilly redneck. Have you ever read a book? If you've ever read a book, then go back and read this one. I didn't write the book. I wrote to people that Howard's my friend and he wrote a book and I did the foreword for the book. That's why my name is on it, you redneck simpleton. And then I called him a bunch of names and then we've never spoken again since.
Well, to give him a little bit of credit, I was so delighted when he held up the poster that had Jerry thinking Lawler. I don't know if you noticed it, because that was the first Eddie Gilbert Memorial Brawl that Dennis did. He held it up.
I've got that poster on my vault ceiling. The Jerry thinking Lawler. The printer couldn't figure out the king. Yeah, I guess it was Dennis's handwriting. But anyway, yeah, Doug had a problem with Howard's book and he blamed me for it. And fuck you, Doug, by the way, just because you're a goddamn idiot to have gone to that lengths to piss me off for this long over something that stupid that you couldn't even fucking figure out. And also, let's be honest, I mean, that was another thing that was weighing Eddie down as a booker, was hauling around his doughy, pudgy, fucking non-talented, hillbilly sounding younger brother, putting him in top positions. Didn't fucking work. But nevertheless, we persevere. We've gone a long time today, haven't we? Now that the severe weather was over, I don't feel like I'm going to die impendingly.
Yeah, the Mets just got rained out. They're in St. Louis.
Well, the Derby's about to get rained out, and are we about to just finish up? We're not going to get rained out. We're indoors, but we'll be done with this episode.
Well, this is your show, but one last thing, because I didn't see the preview. What is next week's Dark Side?
Billy Jack Haynes, baby.
Ooh. I mean, I'm very anxious to see how they. I'm very curious to see how they put this together.
Yes, they got a jailhouse interview, by the way.
Oh, fuck.
Yeah. So this was going to be, because it doesn't even have to make sense with Billy Jack, because nothing about Billy Jack makes sense, and it doesn't even matter the chronological order, because just talk about how fucking batshit he is.
They should just launch a new show. I
can't wait to see the reenactment of him in a lucha mask with a video camera shooting murders and drug deals on the railroad tracks.
They should just launch a new show, 45 minutes with Billy, and just interview him and let him say whatever he wants. And put it up unedited and let people make their own decisions.
I have a feeling the Multnomah County Sheriff's Department might have something to say about that, but